Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our talk on memoir writing and allyship with Dr. Joan Lester and Katya Cengel. It's really nice to have everyone here for this, and I really hope that we cover a lot of ground on this topic. I'll let Katya and Joan take over. Thanks again.
Glad you could join us. And this is the second kind of talk I'm doing with UC Extension, UC Berkeley Extension book talks. And I was really excited when I had heard about Joan's memoir, because I noticed it is about, I have a memoir as well, which was about a love story, but really both of us use that love story to look at bigger issues. It's just kind of a jumping off point. And for Joan, with Loving Before Loving, A Marriage in Black and White, it is about the civil rights movement in the 1950s and her experience as a white woman. And I'm a bit younger than Joan, and so it was really interesting for me in reading this. She actually is an ally and uses that word probably as long as 3 decades ago, at least, 80s, 90s, I lose track of time, maybe even 4 decades ago. So I didn't even realize that was being talked about then. Now we hear it quite a lot and are familiar with it. And it's my impression, we'll get to this when I ask Joan questions later, that it wasn't that well known when she started doing it. And she was one of the first people to really become an ally and identify what that is and do that. So it's really an honor to be able to go and ask her these questions. And the other thing though about her book is it's the love story, like I said, but it's with a time period in a community that maybe she didn't belong as much because she's a white woman, she marries a Black man. And so it's her learning about how much she didn't know about something. And remember, it starts, she's very young. And that, for me, my memoir is about my time in Ukraine, which also becomes very relevant right now, just like we've got that relevancy of what Joan's memoir talks about, and learning how much I didn't know about the former Soviet Union, those types of things. And I was struck with, Joan says at one point, she's really becoming active in the civil rights movement and supportive. And there are incidents she describes though, that just remind her how much segregation had kept her from knowing certain things. And it wasn't that she didn't want to know, it was just the way the world was. Before I get into all my questions, I don't know if you can, I have all my, the best thing about doing these is I get to ask all the things I'm curious about, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you will be curious about as well. So before I get into that, I just wanted to start with Joan reading a little, because when an author in their own words can give us a taste of what this book is like, and she has chosen an excerpt for you guys, but as you'll see in the chat, you can read much more. Her book is readily available online and in bookstores, and she is happy to send book plates, signatures. A little plug for myself as well. My book, From Chernobyl with Love, the same thing. So writers, we always love your support and your interest in our work. So thank you very much, Joan. And with that, would you go ahead and give us a short reading?
I'd love to. Thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be here at this wonderful, venue. And with you, Katya, I certainly enjoyed your book as well and learned a lot that is standing me in good stead with today's news. So the excerpt that I chose is actually at the beginning of the book. And I have just met this man, Julius Lester, I'd never heard of. He had at that time not published anything, although later he became a well-known writer. He was 23 and I was 22. We were both camp counselors in upstate New York, and it was the first day at camp. And I saw him across the lawn, and it was really quite remarkable to see him there, because it was like pretty much every institution that I was in, an all white one. He was the lone Negro man, and I'll talk later about why I use that language, which is what we used at that time. So I walked over to talk to him. And then I write, how many times had I even talked to a Negro man? When I'd worked in New Haven, my friend Eleanor Holmes, a law student, had often taken me to her Yale Law School dining hall. There, I had stared at dark waiters in white gloves who stood silently in front of red velvet drapes covering the windows. It looks like the old South, I'd thought, though I dined with a Negro woman. How can you stand seeing them all lined up on the side of the room? I once asked Eleanor. Look, they have jobs. But it's a segregated job, and wearing those red jackets and white gloves, it's humiliating. This is 1961. It's just like a white liberal to want to take away their jobs, she muttered. Okay, I said with a sigh, I'm glad they have jobs. But these are so embarrassing. How must they feel? Grateful, she spat out. They can feed their families, pay their rent. Get practical, girl. This is a good job. If they can swallow their self-respect. I bit into my chicken, which tasted of the bile rising into my mouth. Self-respect doesn't put food on the table, she snapped. A paycheck does. I give them respect every time I see them, and they acknowledge me. Here she waved to one of the waiters, who hurried to our table. Sir, she began, showing me how it was done. I had chatted with a few Negro men on a New Haven picket line when we were protesting Woolworth's segregated lunch counters, but I'd never flirted the way I was with this guitar-playing man, actually batting my eyelashes. Evidently, I was equally beguiling on this first day at Camp Gulliver. After 20 minutes of chatter, Julie smiled broadly and asked, want to walk into town after lights out? Sure, I nodded, pleased. And then wanting to continue the conversation, I blurted, boy, it's hot. Don't ever call me boy. Julie whipped around, dropping his guitar on the grass so fast that dust rose. His large eyes glared through his glasses. I stepped back confused. I wasn't calling you boy. It's only an expression, just a word. It's so hot. I wiped perspiration from my face to demonstrate. Not to me, it's not just a word. Grown Negro men have been called boy for generations. His deep voice turned sharp. They're not called by their name or Mr. Anybody by white people. They're called boy. Don't you ever say that to me. I won't. I didn't know about it. I'm sorry. Still, his generous mouth turned down and his jaw muscles clenched. I'm sorry, I said again. I wasn't calling you that. Who could know about all this history, about a simple word that could make a grown man jump? I held my breath. His jaw muscles rippled. As he stood draped in his fierce pride, I liked him even more. What could I do to make up for my blunder? Do you still want to go into town tonight? I asked quietly. He remained silent. I waited. His thin, tense face looked as if he might explode again. When I began to walk away, I heard a soft yeah and the sound of an exhale. I turned back and said, I'm sorry once more, for good measure. That was our first conversation, the beginning of an 8-year marriage. Rather inauspicious, but I chose this excerpt because I think it's so telling, as well as I love reading it. You could see the actor, the frustrated actor in me. But, you know, I was so eager to be a friend. I was already knew I was an anti-segregationist, as we called ourselves at that day and age, or we also said we were integrationists. And I knew nothing or very little. You know, I knew about John Brown. My grandfather had given me a pamphlet once. He was a great ally to about John Brown. And I knew, yes, we'd had slavery a long time ago. I just knew so little of both Black history and current Black reality, Black and white reality. And because my town in Connecticut, a small rural town, was completely segregated. Everywhere I went, it was just white people. So I just, other than my friend Eleanor, who later became Eleanor Holmes Norton and serves in Congress today, I just hadn't had experience. So one of the things I want to talk about as we get into this conversation is the need for allies to get information. I mean, it's great to have a good intent, and we shouldn't let our lack of knowledge ever stop us. If we see something going on that we feel like needs interrupting, or if we want to extend a friendly hand to someone, we can't know everything. And we will make mistakes, and we can always apologize. Believe me, people have heard worse. So, but it is incumbent upon us, because segregation has deprived us, as well as depriving the people who were targeted for exclusion, has deprived us of like a wealth of knowledge about whole groups of people who live right here among us and are our fellow citizens. So I think there's so many ways, through literature and plays and movies, and above all, jumping right into multiracial settings and making friends. And, you know, over time, we hang out with people, we're in their homes and they're in our homes, and we meet their parents and their kids, and, you know, we become friends, and we learn a lot. And that's what I've been doing for the 60 years almost since this conversation. And I'm still learning, and I'll tell later about a couple of more recent blunders that I've made, which always amaze me here. This has been my life's work. I've written books, you know, 6 books, and when this is a theme, and hundreds of op-eds, and done trainings all over the country, et cetera, you know, and stuff slips out.
I think that's one thing I really appreciate in your book too, is the brutal honesty, you know. And I think one of the words, the things in our talk together and preparing for this was very revealing, where you said, I didn't know what I didn't know. So, and that really speaks to what you were just talking about. And I wanted to just spend a little more time on that. There was a part later in the book, and you actually kind of reference it on that first meeting with Julius. And it's when the Woolworths protests, you were protesting, I believe, it was, it's weird for me. I know, and we'll get into, actually, maybe we should start with that. The reason for using the term Negro, because I wasn't alive back then. I'm not comfortable saying it, but I realized for literary, because this talks about issues, but it's also about the writing technique. And so at the start of the book, in the 1950s, 60s, you use the term Negro. And then later you use Black. And I was wondering, and I think it was a conscious decision to help readers visualize the time periods better, but I also wanted to know how you came to that, or maybe that isn't the case. I wanted you to explain, because I think probably a lot of us, especially maybe those who weren't alive back then, would like to hear that.
Thank you. Well, language, of course, is always evolving. And when I was growing up, Negro was the polite term. My parents told us we were never to say colored, which was perhaps the predominant term in the 1940s when I was a young child, and then in the 50s. So Negro was the polite term, and it was what most younger Black people called themselves then, but older people who were Black still often use the term colored, because, you know, there isn't one day as language evolves that everybody in a group gets together and says, now we're going to call ourselves XYZ. And often younger people lead the way to new terminology that they feel is more respectful. So in my lifetime, I have trying to follow the term that, people my age were using. I've evolved from Negro to, for a while, it was Afro-American, briefly in the 70s. And then, well, no, it started, I'm sorry, in the late 60s, it was Black, which Stokely Carmichael was one of the first to talk about Black power. And then, of course, the music, Black and Proud. And so it was Negro to Black to Afro-American to African-American, and which was really what was used in newspapers and in most writing for maybe 20, 30 years. And it was really with only in the last 2 years that Black has suddenly come back so much, because that was what people were using, especially after George Floyd's murder. Black Lives Matter. And so ever since Black Lives Matter started as a movement led by women, I have to always point out, the term Black came back. So I decided to use the terminology of the era. One choice point I had as a writer was that the N slur, which I don't think I've ever said aloud, and I won't here or elsewhere, was often hurled at Julius when I was with him. And it just, like any ethnic slur, it's a way of trying to, quote, put people in their place. So I did include that full word in the manuscript, and I talked to my editor about it. Do you think I should do that, especially as a white person? But, I decided in writing I could do that, but I would not read it aloud, which is maybe a strange choice, but the one that I made. And the reason that I made it, and I've talked several Black friends who've read the manuscript have asked me about it and said, wow, I didn't think you would ever use that word. I said, well, I don't use it, but I was quoting other people. And they agreed with me that it was probably a good choice, because the derogatory power of that word was so strong that if I had just said N dash, I think we would have lost some of that. So that was a difficult choice, however, as a writer. But I did want to give the flavor of the different eras.
Yeah,
I think I wanted to add one more thing in terms of the evolution of language, where I feel like I've been behind the curve, and that is in the use of the word queer, which took me a very long time. And we can get into this later, because most viewers probably won't know, but for the last 40 years, I've been married to a woman. So that would be a self-definition. But that was such a pejorative word when I was growing up that I understand why Black older people in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s didn't want to use Black as a self-designation, because it had been flung at them in such a negative way. And I felt that way about queer. It took me a long time to understand what a wonderful inclusive word it is, because it really includes, any, what do we call it, gender non-conforming people, and not only gender, but kind of artistic. It has a wonderful broad meaning, but it took me a very long time to be comfortable with it. I was very uncomfortable.
It's so interesting when we get into the choice of language, and I felt it would have been, if you hadn't used Negro in those earlier periods, it wouldn't have worked. I wouldn't have been in that time frame. So I thought that worked really well to have that. I wanted to take a little more. Your book covers so many different fascinating things, and you started touching on some more there. So I want to spend just one more on kind of what we're talking about there, and what, not knowing what you didn't know, before we move on even further into some of the other topics. But early in the book, you invite a number of Black men, and there's one woman, it just turned out those were the people that were protesting. It was a civil rights protest with you, and you invite them back. You have this tiny little apartment, I think it's like a basement one, and you invite them back for a little party gathering, and you just think, oh, this is nice, you know, and the police end up kicking them all out. I think it's your neighbors complain because there are a bunch of Black people coming down into this apartment, and so they called the police, and the police kick them out, and your guests aren't surprised. They expected it, but you are. And on page, in case anyone has the book and they want to look, it's page 44. You say, I'm going to read the quote here. What I've only now realized is how little I understood about the lives of my guests, how totally segregation had kept us apart. And now, obviously, we don't officially have segregation anymore, but I thought it was interesting to think, do you think there's no law segregating people, but people still are unfamiliar with different worlds, different cultures? And I was wondering, do you think this is still the case for some people, that they don't understand the lives of other people, whether it be white people for Black people, or straight person for queer? I just wanted to spend a little time kind of exploring what you think about that. Maybe in particular, white for Black.
Well, first of all, the targeted population usually knows a lot more about the quote dominant or oppressor population because they have to survive. And they're more often shunted off into, you know, segregated neighborhoods, but they may have to go to a workplace that is not segregated, and they travel on BART and they move around. So it's more the dominant group that we don't know what we don't know because we haven't had as much experience because of residential segregation, you know, schooling segregation, still job segregation to a great extent. So what I often encourage people to do is, who want to be allies more, is consciously place yourself in settings where there are going to be large groups of people from another culture that you're interested in learning more about and becoming friendly with, and particularly organizations that are led by people from that culture. So one thing that I've done in the last, I guess, 30 some years is my wife and I have been members of a spiritual congregation, which is Black led, and 95% of the people there are Black. And I still stumble a little bit sometimes with Black because I said African American so long. And over these many decades, we have become close friends. So our friendship circle is now largely consisting of people that we have met there. And we've learned a lot. But can I give one example, Katya, of something that I just did a few years ago that I couldn't believe came out of my mouth, even with, you know, people I've known for decades. I was going to a backyard party hosted by an African-American woman, and it was going to be, and I figured, and it was all Black people except for my wife and me. And when we walked in, a woman that I knew not well, but I've known her for 30 years, walked out to meet me, and we were going into the backyard. And she said something like, "Oh, I've been here cooking all day with my friend." I said, "Oh," I said, "Oh, you've been slaving in the kitchen all day?" And it's one of those moments that came out of my mouth. I was like, I cannot believe that I said this. I was just horrified. I wanted to drop through the earth. So this woman, and whom I knew, has been a very active and militant woman who was a Black Panther back in the day. And, you know, she's very political. And I said, oh, Suzette, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean that. And fortunately, she just put her arm around my waist and walked me back to the backyard and said, I ain't tripping, girl. But it was a moment. So we don't, even though that's not exactly we don't know what we don't know, but yet the language that I grew up with as a white person, obviously I've heard people say, oh, I was slaving in the kitchen all day. I don't think that Black people say that. I could be wrong, but I've never heard a Black person say that. Some people might, but I don't think it would be in the cultural heritage of language.
That's really interesting. A good segue, because I wanted to we're kind of going back and forth here between talking about content and the issues and the actual writing. And the next question I wanted to kind of, it also gets to content, but it's about writing choice and how the focus developed in your memoir. So I thought it was interesting because, well, the book is about, it's called Loving Before Loving, a Marriage in Black and White. And it is about your relationship with Julius, but it's also uses that relationship to explore much more about race. And what I was surprised, women's rights. I hadn't expected that. And I wanted to know if that was your intention when you set out to write the memoir, or if it changed as you were writing it. Because I think that's something people who are interested in memoir writing things would be interested to know.
Well, this memoir certainly changed in the 5 years that I worked on it, as I think most books do. I've written in a lot of different genres, but I had never written a memoir before. And I think a little part of me felt the way that many non-writers feel, which is that, hey, it's my life. How hard can this be? I was there. I know what happened. Just write it down. But what I learned, of course, is, memoirs are not transcriptions of lives. The script is not laid out. We've had experiences, but they're not stories. We've had a certain experience. So many people had come up to me over the years and said, oh, you should write a memoir. You've had such an interesting life. An interesting life doesn't necessarily make a memoir. So when I should go back to the reason I think I started this I was in my mid-70s. I'm 81 now. And my mom had recently died. I was very lucky to have both my parents, into what some people would call old age. And after she died when I was in my mid-70s, she was the second parent to die. And so it was my first experience of not having any parents. And I think that can often be a moment for people to kind of look at your own life, because now I'm in the oldest generation in my family. I am actually the oldest person in my family, kind of the matriarch. And it was a moment to look back and say, well, in a new way, the way we do at various points in our junctures in our lives, who am I? What has this all been about? I've done this, I've done that, I've done that. What does it all add up to? So I just sat down, I think, in that kind of spirit. And by then I had the writing chops. I've been writing professionally for over 40 years. So I wrote, some beautiful sentences, and I thought, oh, this is really good. And I sent it to my agent, and she wrote me back and said, oh man, the writing is good, but what is this? It's like 4 books. Is this a book about the civil rights movement and your involvement with a Black man? Is it about your life as an activist? Is it about you wanting to be a writer? Is it about a coming out story in middle age? No, actually, it was 5 books. Or is it your life as a woman trying to have an independent, powerful life? So all of those things were in there. And I really had to choose. I often tell writing students, the first sentence of the book should be like an arrow it's like you're shooting it through the book. That's your theme. And you're alerting the reader. This is what this book is about. Well, my book hadn't done that. I mean, my first 6 chapters were childhood and various things that happened to me that I thought were very interesting. So I stripped away the first 6 chapters that I had labored on for years. And I opened the book with meeting Julius. And the reason I decided to choose him as the framework to really be able to tell all these stories that I still wanted to tell was because I could talk about wanting to be a writer in the context of that marriage, because he was a writer. And he had said, I didn't read this part, but in our first meeting, one of the allures of him was that he said he was a writer, and he was, planning to be well published someday. And in fact, he was. He became quite well known during our marriage. So he was a writer. So using that marriage, I could show that he was a mentor to me in many ways as a writer. So I learned a lot, and I edited all of his work for the 8 years we were married. So I learned a lot about being a writer. It also gave me a framework because it was a biracial marriage and we had children. So now I had biracial children, and for the rest of my life, I became part of a biracial family. And I was always an activist from well before the time I had met him in terms of race. So, but being with him, was a great framework to talk about all of that. And it gave me a framework also for discussing myself as a woman and my own struggles to take myself seriously. I became very active in the first phases of what became known as this wave of the women's movement of the women's liberation movement of the late 60s. And I devote several chapters to that in the book. But being heterosexually married, there's a lot of grist for that topic, as well as the DMV not allowing me the name that I chose. So that relationship gave me a framework, not only for all those issues that I could follow, as sub-themes through the book, but it was a framework for a relationship that became lifelong. He passed away 3 years ago, but for the rest of our lives, we remained close. And a sidebar kind of to writers, it's amazing the healing that can happen in writing a book. I didn't know how much resentment I still harbored about him when I was writing early drafts. And as I wrote more drafts and he became a fuller person, and once I chose that framework, and he was in the memoir from beginning to end, I realized what a companion of my life he had been, even well after the marriage, and what an influential person and what a foundational experience of my life that marriage had been. So it's not a totally bait and switch technique to advertise the marriage, because it really was so foundational that it could provide the framework for me to take a look at a whole life.
Yeah, if I remember right, you were talking to him maybe even as often as every day after you divorced. You were still like and it wasn't just about the kids or anything. You guys were still, especially spiritually and also through career-wise and stuff, we're regularly talking, which we don't always see. So yeah, it continued. I looking at that in your relationship with him, I wanted to look at earlier, and you talked about your friend. You had a Black friend earlier, and you had and she'd exposed you to a little bit, and you were active in the civil rights movement. But then we hear jokes sometimes about the best way to learn a language, people say, is to have a lover in that language. And I wanted to see if there is something there. I remember in my case, it was I ended up marrying a Ukrainian when I was, well, we married after, but I had been living in Ukraine. And when I was in Ukraine and we became engaged, I remember I was accepted in a different way by Ukrainians. And up until then, I lived in Ukraine. I had friends in Ukraine, all those things. But it was when I had almost, I guess it's family member, because once you get married, engaged, it's a family member, that I was viewed differently. And so I wanted to look at with you and Julius, could you say a little more about how that relationship allowed you in, but also at the same time kind of kept you out, maybe during the marriage and even after, because like you said, the marriage ended, but the relationship continued.
It's such a complex topic. Thank you for asking it. And I don't mean that in a facetious way, because the more ties that we have to people in a culture, okay, I'll say me into Black culture. So many friends, my children, my grandchildren now, all these people are African-American, my ex-husbands, 2 of them, and one of them that I did keep up with for the rest of his life. So I have these strong bonds, and that does matter to people in a culture, to Black people. I know when I meet them and they understand that they're not my first Black friend, which I think matters. I'm not kind of experimenting with them or learning everything with them, although I learn from everybody I know. So there is in a way that we do step somewhat inside a culture, and we're hanging around with people in the evening and parties, and we learn music and language. But there's also a way, and I know that you experience this, that we're never going to be completely in the culture for several reasons. One is the way that we're treated when we're not with our family member. So when I go into the grocery store alone, without my kids at the time when they were younger, I'm just a white woman. And that's how people perceive me. And they sometimes did say very racist things to me, thinking I would be a kindred spirit. I'm treated differently, but I'm also treated with a kind of respect, like an unconscious white supremacist respect, that the way white people often treat other white people, unawarely giving them a certain kind of dignity. So there's that, and that's always going to be the case. But there's also, and I've become more aware of this in the last few years, the way that our upbringing as white people has seeped into our thinking. So, and it's white supremacy. So to give you another example, something I wrote a blog about, if anybody wants to go to my webpage, joanlester.com, and look at my blog page. I think last year I wrote this blog when I remembered something that had happened a few years ago. I was a member for, maybe 20, 30 years of a women's choir in Oakland that was all African-American women, except for me. So obviously over the years, I got to know a number of the people quite well, and we would see each other outside of choir rehearsal. But one night at choir rehearsal, the director told us to move our chairs in a certain way. I was the soprano, and the sopranos should move over here and the altos should move over there. And all of a sudden I heard myself saying to people, "Oh, altos, move your chairs here, put them over there." And I was directing the people, 20 women. And all of a sudden I caught the eye of a woman I knew well, and she was kind of giving me the side eye. And I said to her, "Oh, white people always have to be in charge, don't we?" And she said, yeah, and kind of turned away. We were still friends, but it was a moment. So that really showed me that we have to be aware of what our own training is. I mean, you could say I'm just a leader, which is true. I am a leader, and I'm a good community organizer and leader of groups. But I have to be aware of context. It's one thing if I'm in a group of white people, let's say all white women, and I'm saying, oh, move the chair, let's move the chairs this way, move them there. But I have to be aware of context because of all the hundreds of years of history of white people telling Black people, do this, do that, do that, do that, assuming that they don't have the intelligence or agency to figure it out for themselves. So there's a certain kind of awareness and humility that I think we need. So in that way, yes, I was a cherished member of that group and fine, and I'm friends with people and loved and blah, blah, blah. But that was a moment when I was suddenly aware of myself as a white woman in a Black space, taking charge in a way that probably was not most appropriate. And this other woman that I knew well, who was also very political, I noticed her, maybe that's probably what triggered my awareness. I noticed her giving me a look, and I just kind of like, I heard myself. Ugh.
I think that's so key. Context is how in one context it could be very different from others. I wanted to segue to writing again a little bit and talk about, well, and this is a choice with memoir writing, and we're talking about something as intimate as a relationship. Having written my book and not shared it with my ex-husband, I was I don't know, surprised or just curious to see you had actually shared your book with Julius before it published. But I was also surprised to learn this when he actually had written his own memoir, and I didn't read it, but in your book, you say you didn't come out necessarily nicely in it. And I think later he even apologizes for that. But even after that, when you write your memoir years later, you gave it to him first. And I was wondering if you think some of that goes back to being a man, him being a man and you being a woman. Maybe I'm totally off base there or something, or I just wanted to kind of explore that a little. I mean, because I'm a woman and I didn't send it to my ex, and reading yours, I felt a little bad. I'm like, oh, maybe I should have, but I didn't. So I was curious your thought.
I think it is somewhat gender related, but in my particular case with him, I think a lot of it was age related. He wrote his memoir about me and our marriage when he was 35 and very full of himself. And we had only been divorced a couple of years. We were not on the best of terms probably at that time, or certainly not in the way that we ultimately grew to become. He was not in a good place. He'd gotten so lauded. You know, I really learned through watching this with him, what can happen to somebody who achieves huge artistic success at a young age? And they're just lionized, and their ego can bloom in very unpleasant ways. So I have to say, so he was whatever, mid-30s. By the time I sent him my memoir, I was almost 80. If I had written a memoir about him at 35, it would not have been nice. Okay, that blah, 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 blah. And he left us and he left the children and blah, 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 blah. Okay, I was angry for a long time and hurt. But with age, with me anyway, you know, a lot of forgiveness has developed of him and of myself. He wasn't the only one who failed in the marriage. I failed him as well. And I began to be able to see that more clearly and to forgive both of us. We were young, we were doing our best. It was the huge pressure of the civil rights movement. He had Black people in the movement breathing down his neck saying, you talk Black, but you're sleeping white. He had all the pressures of that and the new fame and 2 babies, and he's trying to make it as a writer, and we had no money. And I had all the pressures of the 2 babies, and I'm trying to be an independent intellectual and have no idea how to do that, and working at, crap jobs because he's off in the civil rights movement. I mean, there was just so much going on. So I could forgive both of us. So I think perhaps the greatest difference between the time when he wrote his memoir and I wrote mine was our ages, and we had mellowed and, gotten closer. But I have to say something else. I think there is an ethos, and it's definitely something that's still controversial. And there was a New York Times Magazine article about it within the last year about whether or not, or what right do people have to sort of other people's stories. And of course, a writer can always say, well, this is the way I experienced it. So this is my life, this is my story, and kind of let the chips fall where they may. This is art. And when I was in college in the 50s, and I think this has persisted a lot, it was sort of the great man theory of art. Oh, this is art. So I'm in my study, and the women should keep the children quiet over there, because everything is for art. And who cares if blah, 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 I can't do anything but my art. And that's all that matters. And I actually sent this memoir not only to Julius, but to every single person I mentioned in the book, saying, not that I'll change anything you don't like, but I said, I want you to see it. This is the way I experience things. If there's anything that you're uncomfortable with, please tell me, and I will open a discussion with you. I'm willing to listen. So Julius only had one phrase in the whole book, and I thought there was some pretty damning stuff about him. In fact, one woman who knew us both then said after she read a draft, because she was one of the blurbers, I'd like to just kick him in the balls because she was so mad at the way he had acted in our marriage. So I thought I was not being, overly nice, but he didn't have a problem with anything except a small phrase, and which I was happy to take out. And he was very grateful, and he was grateful that I showed it to him. And so were other people. But it was important to me not only to think about that I didn't want to hurt them, but I wanted to see the accuracy of my own memory. So Nancy Schwerner, who was the wife of Steve Schwerner, the brother of Mickey Schwerner, who was one of the 3 civil rights workers killed in Mississippi, and I was friends with all of them. I said, I wanted to make sure that I was remembering things accurately, but only one other person said she couldn't remember a conversation. She's just in one scene. And so she asked me to change her name, which I was happy to do. Everybody else, except my children, has, their real names, but I wanted to give the kids some little modicum of privacy. But that to me is important, that I'm not hurting people, because kind of what's the point? I think I could say things that are true, but in a way, or maybe elide, a few details if they're really going to be hurtful to somebody.
No, that makes complete sense. And I think if I wrote mine, I think although I was younger when I wrote mine, it was still enough after the relationship that I realized it was both of us, it didn't work, and tried to just be fair in that way. I wanted to kind of look at some quotes you had that go back to being a woman, because it's interesting that even decades later, because you're talking about when you were a young woman, I can relate to the things you were saying about being a woman and how something just, yeah, they change, and yet there's some things that still stay there. And so there was a quote I wanted to read where you have, you're talking about your young woman, you have your own place finally, all your own, and you're really excited. And then Julius ends up, you guys are already dating, not married yet, but dating, and he needs a place to stay. And so you let him in, but there's definitely reluctance. And then afterwards, you kind of regret how you just let him in without any rules or restrictions or anything. And I think this quote, what you say soon after you write, kind of, because there was, at this point, he was a writer, and you almost become secondary to him. And you say, he was the writer, the Negro writer, and I turned out to be the girlfriend, the white girlfriend who gave him whatever he needed. And I think as women, most women could probably relate to this, where you fear kind of losing yourself to the man, especially moving in, marriage, those kind of things. And I kind of wanted you just to say a little more about that.
Well, I think for most women, this is a theme of our lives, how to claim ourselves as persons of substance who merit great care. The female training is so invested in nurturance, which is lovely. I mean, great. All human beings have the capacity to be nurturing and loving and thinking of others, and that's lovely. But it's often at the expense of thinking well about ourselves and what we need. And certainly that continues to this day. Although I think partly because of this wave of the women's movement, more girls and young women who are playing sports, which can develop so much confidence, and who are being taught that you matter, that hopefully it's not quite as big a struggle as it was for us back then. But I know my wife coaches, she's an executive coach for women in very senior global corporate teams. And it's amazing to me to hear how much it's still so much the same struggles of people taking themselves seriously and the men not taking them seriously, because they're usually the only woman on a global corporate team of 10 people and 9 are men. And it's the same thing. The woman says something and she's dissed, and then a man later says the same thing, and oh, what a great idea. And I've heard programs of and read about books where women talk about women always saying they're sorry no matter what. They say, oh, I'm sorry. Apologizing for our existence half the time. So it's a struggle, and it's not surprising. It's a struggle when our male leaders, our political leader. I mean, we've never had a woman president. We have a Speaker of the House, but all of our leaders politically are mostly still men. The corporate leaders are mostly still men. It always amazes me when I see a picture of Senate leadership or something, how much it's still primarily men. So we've grown up with that, thinking men should lead, men know best. Every once in a while, I'll say to Carol, my wife, we can't figure out how to do a plumbing thing. And I'll say, oh, maybe we should ask Paul, her brother, who lives 30 miles away. And she's like, yeah, because he's a man, he'll know, So we just have this assumption, if only we had a man here to figure this stuff out, or technology, whatever. And that's just internalized sexism. So I think the more we can name it, and claim ourselves as powerful, knowledgeable people, we can not lose ourselves so much in relationships. But it's definitely was a struggle for me, and I talk about that a lot. And I felt really good in the book with my second marriage to a man, my third marriage being to Carol, but my second marriage, when that husband wanted me to take his name. But by then I'd already had the name Lester, and the kids, this was the crucial thing, had the last name Lester, and I wanted to have the same last name as them for their sake. And I refused, and he was pretty adamant about it. So that's when I felt like, okay, I was like 31 or something then, that I really began to assert myself more.
I want to move on to allyship, but before I do, I'll read one more quote on this theme that I thought there were a bunch of these, and I just think it's interesting for those who may be younger to see how it was relevant then, it's relevant now, but it was it part of being female, this inability to hold my own shape in the face of others' suffering, others' needs. And it really kind of, you were just talking about this, so I'm not going to have you say more on that. I want to move on to allyship. I just like that quote. So in the second half of the book, you have a sexual encounter with a woman, and this is your first time. That before this, you had never, you just been living heterosexual life, and you end up shutting her out because of your own fear. So you have the sexual encounter and then you ignore her. And I thought the statement you made there is useful when we talk about allyship and understanding. And it says, it's helpful to have had an experience of being on the other side to give me compassion and remind me of the power of fear, giving a glimpse into other incomprehensible behavior. And you had a career, as well as being a writer, you had a career where you actually taught people about allyship and these things. So I was wondering if you could say a little more about this, and especially, I think it was an honesty that'll help people. You had already talked about mistakes you make and things and stuff, but how having that experience of being on the other side, you were able to be aware of how some of these prejudices and things come from fear.
You know, the last 60 years, I guess, really since the beginning of the civil rights movement, of this wave and then the women's movement, you know, what I've observed has been we make gains and then there's pushback. And that's just in my lifetime. That's been the case all along, as we've learned about like the so-called Tulsa race riots, which I always hate when they call it race riots because it was a massacre by white people of Black people. But that was instigated by white people because in Tulsa, where they had built what they called Black Wall Street, they were very prosperous community and businesses and beautiful homes, and it just, white people couldn't stand it. And that's what I've seen over and over. You know, we got abortion right. We've gotten this, we've gotten that. And I understand that the pushback comes so much from fear. If you get rights, if your people can become mayors and senators and leaders and be prosperous, well, what about me? I, the white man who worked so hard all my life. My parents were immigrants, and, you know, I've worked hard. I'm afraid that I'm going to be shunted. There's all this attention now, let's say affirmative action, or, you know, giving a leg up to people, or reparations now, discussion of. What about me? I heard that when I started training in the 70s. What about me? I applied for a job, and this is terrible, and they told me I didn't get it because I was white. You know, I mean, first of all, in any decent affirmative action program, nobody should ever say that. And it's never true. That's it's supposed to be one of many criteria. And you never say that. So I don't know if that people really, but I heard that over and over again in seminars. So there's just a lot of fear. And when I saw myself acting in a really mean way to somebody the next day, when this woman called me and said, you know, I think I'm in love with you. And I said, basically, I don't want to have anything to do with you, and hung up. It was pure terror. And I never did have anything to do with another woman, you know, romantically until I met Carol. It was just a lot of fear. It was homophobia. So I think it helped me to see with men or with white people, just have a little more compassion, which I think we need, because I do believe now, you know, anger and rage stoked a lot of my activism when I was very young. And over the years, I've come to realize that, you know, love, that we need to open our hearts to people and love them, even when they're acting in ways that we find reprehensible, and that we can build relationships and more easily reach people.
I think that was great. And I think we'll, in just 1 second, we're going to take questions, but I wanted, you actually had a reading, Joan, that kind of was about allyship, because I think it's a good thing to end on. And I was thinking maybe we'll just have kind of your words once more on that, and then we'll answer any questions people might have.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and actually, that was a good lead in.
Yeah, exactly.
What I would like to read. This excerpt takes place in 1981. I had just met the woman who would become my wife, Carol Johnson, and she and I together started an anti-racist organization called Equity Institute with some other folks. We lived in Amherst, Massachusetts then. And this is from the book. Our first high-profile job was sensitivity training with the Amherst police. All 33 were white. Remember, this is 1981. Nobody's doing this. 31 of these 33 were men. They had read about me in a local newspaper profile. I conducted the series of full-day trainings alone because I didn't know any better at that point. You're in for a tough time, Julius warned me one night on the phone. They don't play. More power to you. First, I got to know the police officers, conducting private interviews with each one, listening to their concerns. Most of them were furious about the mandatory training, feeling they had been unfairly branded as racist. We're just doing our jobs, they complained. Nobody understands how we're caught in the middle. I listened and nodded, projecting calm confidence, but soon I wrote in my journal, the first day of an 8-week workshop, and I'm terrified. Why did I choose this business, or why did it choose me? This is what I could do here, what needed to be done. It's clearly the right work at the right time, but oh, how scary. A few of the younger cops privately admitted to me their horror at, quote, what they called sadistic beatings of colored people. One man confessed, I vomited later, in a note that he wrote for me to read anonymously to the group. They faced a tough internal culture, I learned, with a job as frontline enforcers for the status quo. Each one was afraid of violent peer retaliation if they didn't follow the unspoken rules for the cruel justice they were expected to dispense. Each day I, who had so recently called cops pigs, looked at a Jan Winston painting on my living room wall titled, Every Seed is Awakened with Love. And I tried to love each one as well as I could and open them to the devastating impacts of their behavior. By the end of the series, I had gotten through to a few and given them strategies for change.
It's such a hopeful thing to end on too, and the things, and that's with the memoir being about love. Both of us use love in the title of our memoirs, and so I think it's, and that wasn't, I don't think, just because of that relationship. It was more, I wanted to, we've got a question here from Alan. He says, as an ally to Black and brown people, how did the racism and hatred of the Trump presidency resonate with you?
Okay, well, my first book was entitled The Future of White Men and Other Diversity Dilemmas. And it was a collection of essays that had mostly been published as op-eds in newspapers about various diversity issues, but particularly race. And I had some boxes of books, of that, copies of that book. And I offered my neighbors in my almost all white neighborhood free copies of the book. And I put it out on my front porch, and 31 people, I think, took copies. And then once Black Lives Matter became a bigger national slogan, I made a huge banner out of a sheet and put it on my front fence. And I set up 2 chairs, one for me and one for anybody that wanted to stop by and talk. And I put out chalk, and I invited people. I named my driveway, which we no longer park in, Black Lives Matter driveway plaza. That was what we called it, Black Lives Matter Plaza. And so it was horrifying. Kids in the cages at the border, everything. But I just felt like I stepped up my allyship, and I've organized a community group and so on. And I'll give a shout out to somebody I see, Joyce Perkins, who is somebody that we knew each other. She was also a white woman married to a Black activist, and we knew each other just briefly, slightly in the early 60s. So she's here. Thank you.
That is fun to hear. I'll give it just a minute or so more if people want to ask questions before I turn it over to Jeff to kind of close us out.
Oh, I have something else I'd like to say.
Yeah.
I was thinking, of course, before this about being an ally, and I remembered a poem that I actually quote in my first book that I love. It's by Pat Parker, who was a Black lesbian poet in San Francisco in the 60s, 70s, 80s. I think she died in the 80s. And I love it. It's called For the White Person Who Wants to Know How to Be My Friend. The first thing you do is forget that I'm Black. Second, you must never forget that I'm Black. You should be able to dig Aretha, but don't play her every time I come over. And if you decide to play Beethoven, don't tell me his life story. They made us take music appreciation too. Eat soul food if you like it, but don't expect me to locate your restaurants or cook it for you. And I won't read the rest. That's like the first third of the poem. But I've always loved that, because I think it encapsulates the double-mindedness that we need as allies, which is interesting because Du Bois talked in the early 20th century about the double-mindedness of Black people who are American and Black, and always have to remember that. But I think when I was talking earlier about context, as a white person, when we're in Black or brown settings, yes, we always want to remember that the people we're with are Black or brown, and we want to forget that too.
I hadn't heard that poem before. I really like that.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah.
Yeah.
Her name is Pat Parker. She was quite a poet.
We've got one last question from Joyce, wondering what most challenging issues you had raising your children, past and present.
Well, I think for all biracial children, there are a lot of issues. You know, who am I? What am I? Am I Black? Am I white? And the context that they're raised in, you know, makes a big difference probably in how they answer that question. I'm not going to talk about my kids personally, just because their father wrote about them all the time. And then I published a lot of newspaper articles, you know, about incidents of things that had happened to them that were illuminating. But in general, it's only what in the last, I'm just going to guess 20, 25 years that there was a biracial category in the census. So people were always kind of forced to choose a culture. And if they had, you know, a mother and a father of different ethnic groups, you know, how are they supposed to choose? I identify just with this parent or with that parent. So there's a lot of literature about that. In fact, I have a young adult novel called Black, White, Other that is just about that. It's about a 15-year-old girl who faces some of those issues.
Great, and I apologize, Joan and audience. There were more questions. And so there are 3 more. I just hadn't seen them. So,
Okay.
and so I will ask those to you now. From Robert, we have the fascinating thing about both your stories is how the intimate and the political kind of come together. The one runs into the other. There's no bright line between. I'd love to hear more about that and how it informs your memoirs.
You want me to start? And then you?
Yes, that sounds good.
Well, I think in life, there's no bright line. You know, we live in a culture. So we are political beings, whether or not we choose to acknowledge that. And we have personal lives, but I think they always bleed into each other in ways that, especially when we're part of the dominant group, we don't necessarily always see. We think, oh, that's just normal. I used to have people, and it still, I think, happens in seminars, who, when we ask people about their ethnic background, white people will say, I'm just normal American. So that's, you know, they don't see, it's like the fish in the sea or something. Yeah. But do you want to say something?
Yeah, I think for me, I actually had first wanted to tell a story about, I was in Ukraine as a young journalist about 2000 to 2003. And it was really interesting time there because it hadn't been that just around a decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so I wanted to tell a story about the people and what it was like life there, but I realized the way to approach that best was through the love story. And that kind of allowed me into the things I wanted to talk about. And it gave kind of that intimate look at the bigger things. And I think so for me, it was almost a literary technique a little bit to use that love story and that relationship to look at these bigger things and look at kind of the conflict and everything that was going on in Ukraine. And now we've got more. The interesting thing, both our memoirs, we chose topics that, although they're from the past, they keep being relevant more and more. And in the news, I saw New York Times today, there was something about how to pronounce Kiev, capital of Ukraine. And so there's always relevancy. I want to look at a question from Amazons. I am a white Jewish sibling to a Black sister who has a different father. Can you speak to the alienation in mixed families? We are very close, yet there's also sometimes tension due to our different experience in the world.
Yeah, I mean, what can I say? Yes. I mean, yes, people do have different experiences. And that's so common in families, in mixed families. Even when people have the same biological parents, that their they're going to be visibly present differently and therefore treated differently. And, you know, skin tone, which is a huge issue. We haven't gotten into colorism, but dark-skinned people have a very different experience than lighter-skinned people of color. So I'm sure the tensions are there. And I've seen that with my own grandchildren who are of different hues and therefore perceived differently. So I'm not sure what else to say about that other than, yes, that exists, and love and compassion can go a long way. And to understand that people, I think the first thing is to understand that people are having genuinely different experiences in the world, which may be invisible to the lighter skinned people.
And we've got one from Laurel here. Your writing is so powerful. Can you share other tips to writers on how to improve their craft?
Well, I do have actually on my website, joanlester.com, a page called Tips for Writers. Rewriting and revising is something that I'm very big on. I happen to like doing it. Some writers don't. But I think especially for newer writers, you may expect when you write a first or second or third draft that it's going to be really great. And if it isn't, if the logic isn't tight as you go through, or, you know, the same way that trees are often improved in their looks when they're pruned. If you prune your prose, and sometimes it's a great exercise to, let's say you've written 10 pages. What about trying to condense it to 5 pages? You have to really get at the, you know, the most critical substance of it. So I'm not sure, just sort of in general tips. The other general tip is do it. That's probably the biggest tip, the most helpful one I could give. And don't wait until you think you have the perfect everything, the perfect time. Oh, when the house is clear, you know, when there's nobody around and I have a week, or, you know, just do it whenever you can and practice it. You're practicing a craft, and like anything else, the more you do it, the better you'll get. I mean, I'm amazed when I look back at my first published book, which was now, I don't know, almost 30 years ago. I thought it was really well written at the time. It's not bad, but my writing has definitely improved.
I think what you were saying too about getting rid of the first 5 chapters in your memoir, and it's very true. I always tell my journalism students too, a lot of times, start writing, and then you'll find out what the core of the story is about halfway through, and just get rid of that whole first part. So it holds true for shorter pieces and long pieces. One last quick question here, and then I'm gonna turn it to Jeff so he can kind of give you some more advice and wrap it up. And this is one I can say something on two. You can say, it says, which is better to have, an agent or an editor? I think you kind of have to have an editor. No matter what, you'll have an editor you work with on the book, but also even before you send it off, you need someone to look at your work. You always need someone there. Agent is always good to have, but they're not a necessity as much as an editor, I think would be mine. But Joan, you want to kind of?
I agree. Smaller presses especially will look at unagented material. If you're thinking of a book, you don't necessarily need an agent to publish op-eds or smaller pieces. But larger presses typically will not even consider any unagented material.
Well, okay, I guess if that's all we really have for today for Q&A, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you, especially Katya and Joan, for, well, first bringing this to me. I couldn't have been happier to get that email, but also for agreeing to come here today. As we mentioned earlier, Katya and Joan have both offered to send out signed book plates to anybody who would like them. So if you are interested, go ahead and email me at jmetro@berkeley.edu. I put my email in the chat earlier, but I'm all over the website and I'm easy to find if you go to the writing pages, that extension. I forgot to introduce myself fully earlier. I'm the program manager at UC Berkeley Extension for the Humanities. If you want to get a little bit more of Katya, she'll be teaching a journalism workshop that starts on March 22nd this spring. That class will be offered asynchronously in the fixed date format, so it doesn't really matter where you're from or where you are and how you access that class. It's much more accessible and self-paced than a live offering. But you would still be getting direct feedback from Katya on your work. While you're there, if you're interested, we have a number of writing programs as well that I'd be really personally happy if you guys would all check out. Thanks everyone so much for coming and for a great discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.